Ah, Harry. Good morning. Yes, do come in, said Dumbledore. He smiled as Harry entered his portable study, which he had sited just underneath the stairs in Grimmauld Place. What was it you wanted to see me about? Asked Harry, looking uncertain. Please sit down, continued Dumbledore, and gestured towards some pumpkin juice on the table. Harry shook his head. It's about Mrs. Frobisher, isn't it? He said, when Dumbledore hadn't answered his question. What do you think of her, Harry? Dumbledore began to pace before the fireplace. That wasn't what I expected you to ask me, Professor, admitted Harry. I'm not sure what you're asking me, sir. Your opinion of her, Harry. For example, do you like her? Harry looked back at Dumbledore, who continued to pace, ducking sideways momentarily as the books on the shelves by the fireplace pulled themselves out and restacked around him. Well, G'(s), OK. I think. He relied uncertainly, wishing that he'd asked what Ron thought of her, and Dumbledore looked at him. Why do you think I asked you this question, Harry? I dunno. Not sure, really, he replied, then thought. Why has he asked me? Is it because she's a mole, Professor? He asked. In part, yes, said Dumbledore. You were brought up in a mole household, with your aunt and uncle, he said, and Harry rolled his eyes. Don't remind me, he thought. So you are aware of what moles can and cannot do in terms of their ability, said Dumbledore. I suppose so, said Harry, well and truly lost now. Would you agree with me if I were to say then, that some moles are intelligent, and have abilities and talents far and away in advance of other moles? Yes, I suppose so. I mean, it's like comparing. He paused, trying to work out if he dare make the comparison, but decided to go for it anyway. Gregory Goyle to ... you. He said, ignoring Dumbledore's raised eyebrow. Or if you're talking about moles, my cousin Dudley too. He paused, someone like Stephen Hawking. Dumbledore looked at him, questioningly. Stephen Hawking is a very intelligent mole, explained Harry, and Dumbledore stopped pacing to look at him. You see my point, Harry. Which is why we chose Mrs. Frobisher, out of a multitude of different moles, to work with Professor Snape. He paused, allowing the message implicit in the statement sink in. Last Saturday, if you are not already aware of this information from other means, Harry, she became the first mole member of the Order of the Phoenix. The reason I believed she should join was, first and foremost, to become accustomed to our ways, as she will, for several months hence, be working with Professor Snape. Dumbledore began to pace again, and Harry shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Is this about Sirius? Asked Harry. I saw her when she was unconscious. And, I heard Mrs. Weasley say it was only because of luck she didn't die. Dumbledore nodded. Whatever Sirius may have said to you, Harry, she is not a threat or danger to you. Indeed, it was quite wrong of him to treat her so appallingly. You see, we need Mrs. Frobisher. We need her to investigate mole science, with the purpose of discovering why Lord Voldemort was not able to kill you when you were a baby. With this information, we then intend to develop a means to defeat him. Why are you telling me all this, Professor? Asked Harry suddenly, wondering why Sirius had been so guarded when they had spoken. What has this got to do with me? The hope is that Professor Snape will be able to use the information Mrs. Frobisher provides to create a weapon to defeat Voldemort. In order to do that, Mrs. Frobisher needs your input when you return to school. I know that this is your owl year, but we will never have a chance like this again to defeat him. But Sirius, insisted Harry. He says she ''s. Well. He didn't really want to say to Dumbledore what Sirius actually had said about her. But Dumbledore appeared, with his usual incredible perception, to grasp what Harry was trying not to say. I have spoken to Sirius, said Dumbledore slowly. he realizes his actions were wrong and is ashamed. We are very fortunate to still have Mrs. Frobisher after all of this. Harry nodded slowly. Therefore, I ask three things of you. Firstly, during the course of her work I wish you to cooperate with her. Should there be any reason that you cannot or wish not to, please tell her your reasons why. Secondly, she may ask you to give information about your mother and father. She is aware of the circumstances by which your parents met their deaths, which brings me on to my third point. He stopped pacing, and looked directly at Harry. Thirdly, and this is most important, Harry, she is a mole. The science she practices is the very reason she is with us. She may however find things difficult, especially being in a world so different to her own, and she may at times appear naive to our ways. She is, after all, a mole adult, and it is a real challenge for any of us to change. He paused, allowing the information to sink in before continuing. I am sure you remember what it was like in your first year, when you found out you were a wizard, and therefore I expect a measure of understanding and empathy for Mrs. Frobisher will follow. Harry nodded again, taking it all in. Are there any questions? Harry shook his head. Very well, replied Dumbledore, that is all. Just as Harry got to the door, Dumbledore spoke again. Oh, just one more thing before you go. We do not know yet where the research will lead, therefore whatever you discuss with her will remain confidential between you, for the sake of security. Considering the circumstances of last Saturday, Harry, it would be only fitting that you show Cecilia the same courtesy. 88,888,888. After a fitful night, Cecilia awoke, and wondered if she had overslept. I'd better hurry, she thought, or else I won't be able to get anything substantial done today, and hastily pushed the bedclothes off her. It was only after she swung her legs out of bed, cursing aloud as she did so in response to the searing pain, that the events of the last week occurred to her, and she flopped back down on the bed. She swore under her breath as she steadied herself, and random snippets of the last few days flitted past her head. What am I doing here, she thought to herself, looking round the room. Is it really worth all this? Isn't it strange, said another voice in her head, that you're so familiar with this place, though? It doesn't seem like a moment's passed since you was here. Mulling this thought over, Cecilia got up steadily this time, scrutinizing her appearance. Ugh, you look disgusting, she concluded. She was still in the clothes she had flued in the afternoon before. She considered what had gone on, and considered how strange it was that, after she had been so excited about seeing Tunks a week ago, she had never been gladder to get away from Grimmauld Place and back here. Cecilia looked round the room again and thought about what had happened since she had hurried so quickly to pack and leave. She'd wanted to get away so badly then, to see Tunks and the others. What if she had stayed put? Well, she wouldn't have been in this state, for a start. Her gaze caught a pile of washing stacked high on her chair in the corner, and she remembered how she'd been unable to leave anything around for more than 2 seconds before Dobby had whisked it all off to be washed. That was until he'd discovered what happens when you try to wash potassium. Oh Dobby, she thought, thank you, as she took a towel off the pile and headed towards the bathroom, considering how odd her life had become that the elf had had an impact on her life. What struck Cecilia as most bizarre, however, was feeling happy to be back in a magic school, of all places. As she ran the tap in the sink, she noticed something scribbled on what she recognized as a page from the back of lab notebook, propped by the taps. She stared at it for a few minutes before she realized that it was a message. To Lady, she read, squinting to read the small, spidery writing. To make the bath lady. Cecilia frowned. It was clearly from Dobby. He was the only person who called her lady. But what did he mean? She turned round, scanning the room. She hadn't noticed that the huge bath was full with hot foamy water. Thank you, Dobby, she thought gratefully, and carefully took off her clothes, discarding them quickly. "Look at the state of you!" exclaimed her reflection, making Cecilia jump and almost fall in as she neared it. She turned and gasped when did see the state of herself. Although she'd had a bath at Grimmauld Place, she hadn't lingered long, but it wasn't surprising that she felt so bad. In addition to the huge bruise covering her left arm, it extended all the way down her left-hand side to her hip and down her outer thigh, the purple hue fading now to a gaunt yellow. She had a cut on her right shoulder too, and when she relaxed her tricep, pain coursed through it. A rush of self-pity overcome her briefly and, shaking slightly, she got into the bath. The heat of the water and the humidity began to work immediately on Cecilia's tense muscles, melting her emotions too. But she still could not think rationally about Sirius Black, or her stay to his home. Nor Remus, come to that. But at least Sirius had the decency to express his feelings, she thought, massaging her neck. Hang on a minute, another part of her mind thought, breaking in on the main event. Are you seriously trying to tell yourself that what he did was justifiable? No, rebuked the first part. I don't even know if I'm still a member of the Order of the Phoenix. You are, said a third part. Dumbledore said so. Hold on, thought Cecilia, trying to put in order the bits of her mind feeding her information all at once. So, if I'm still a member, I suppose I'm expected to go to meetings. Well, I'm not ready to go back there, not yet anyway. I'm such an idiot, sometimes. If only I hadn't been beguiled by his charming manner. Exhaling, she pulled her knees up to her chest slightly and massaged her legs, easing the tension in her calves. But what about Remus? She thought suddenly. Why had he been so insistent in her staying at Grimmauld Place? While Cecilia had been off analyzing her feelings about Sirius Black, she hadn't noticed that Remus Lupin had metaphorically strolled in through the back door of her cerebellum, sat down in the comfiest armchair and put his feet up. Remus. Why wouldn't her mind settle about him? Leaning over for the shampoo, Cecilia tried to think why she couldn't let go of this man. Was she angry with him because he wanted her to stay? Yes, she decided, in part, and massaged the blob of shampoo she had squeezed onto her palm into her hair. Could he not understand she didn't want to be within 100 miles of Grimmauld Place at the moment? Yes, she thought, ignoring the inappropriate feeling that was even now trying to make its voices heard over the cacophony of her consciousness. He'd wanted her to stay at Grimmauld Place. Cecilia worked the shampoo slowly into her hair as she thought. The way he held her hand when she was there. So gently, so tenderly. The way he looked at her. How couldn't he know that she needed to leave and continue her work with Severus? That was it, wasn't it? Of course he didn't want her to return to Hogwarts. Rinsing her hair under the water until there were no bubbles left, she scolded herself aloud for not being quicker on the ball. Black hated Severus. Remus was sticking up for his friend. She shampooed once more, and got out of the bath, drying herself carefully as she did so and vowing she would not spend any more time thinking about Remus Lupin. Regardless of the fact that he was even now leaving an indelible imprint. 20 minutes later and Cecilia was dressed and looking through her equipment and books, trying to remember where she had actually got with the analyses. She wondered what had been left in the potions dungeon, recalling the state it had been last Friday evening. Looking round the room, she considered what was here, and tipped the contents of her travel bag onto the bed. She picked up Magic and Moles and put it to one side, and placed on top of it the sheaf of notes she had made about genetics from it. The get well soon card that the children had made her drifted undulatingly onto the floor, and she tucked it into the back of Magic and Moles. Then her eye caught Mysterious Mythology. I should have just given this back to Remus before I left, she thought, picking it up and putting it on the desk. I doubt it'll be of any use now I've read through it all and made notes. Turning to the pile of equipment in the corner, she sorted through it and, deciding on a few, she packed them into a box. Wondering whether she should leave it and see what was actually still in potions, the door burst open and Dobby hurried in. "Lady!" he yelled, hopping from one foot to another, and then frowned when he saw her lifting the box. "Lady must not be doing this. Dobby will take it," and he grabbed the box from her. "Dobby," said Cecilia, smiling. "Thank you for the bath, it was lovely." Dobby smiled back, and frowned again. Looking from left to right, he whispered. "Dark wizards hurt Lady," said Dobby, frowning again and looking from side to side. "But Lady is all right?" "Yes, all right," agreed Cecilia, considering that being a dark wizard was probably quite an accurate description of Sirius Black last Saturday. "And Harry Potter saved you," said Dobby, exultantly, turning and walking quickly out of the door before Cecilia had time to interject. "Harry Potter freed Dobby, Lady. Harry Potter is a very powerful wizard," he continued, and as Cecilia hurried to keep up him, was privy to exorbitant greatness of Harry Potter. 88,888,888. Cecilia surveyed the potions dungeon as Dobby busily unpacked her paraphernalia. Sitting on the edge of one of the student benches, she considered all that had gone on here. Discounting Snape's loss of temper last week, she considered their working relationship passable, all things considered. And Harry Potter, well. He handed the book back to Dobby's former master. Continued Dobby, as he placed some flasks on the bench in front of him. Cecilia looked over at Dobby, who had been recounting for the third time the story of how Dobby had been presented with clothes, and smiled. "And do you know what happened then, Lady?" Cecilia smiled again and shook her head, so as to humor the elf. "He gave Dobby the book ... and inside ... was a sock." Dobby grinned wildly, continuing to place her books on the shelf. Cecilia rose, and smiled down at him. "Dobby," she said, picking up the potions she had been working on last week. "When I left last week, this place was in an awful state. Did you clean it all up?" "No, Lady," said Dobby, glancing down. Dobby was going to, and even Winky thought Dobby had tidied the potions dungeon. But after what Lady said, and then he did it. He glanced from side to side, a fearful look in his eyes. "Professor Snape," finished Cecilia, a touch of incredulity in her voice. "Yes," said Dobby. "But Dobby wanted to, Lady." "Severus," thought Cecilia, as she scanned the table. He'd grouped the potions she had tested to one side, and tidied the ingredients he knew she'd left out. It looked like he might even have tried finishing the ketolysis reaction she'd been halfway through, judging from the two ruined conical flasks in the corner, which had been stained an ugly mustard yellow color, and she felt her heart soften a little, imagining the foreboding, stone-faced wizard taking the trouble on her account. "Dobby," said Cecilia carefully, turning to him as he stacked the last of her watch glasses under the bench. "Would you mind if I asked you about your life, when you were with the family you served?" "No," Dobby would not mind, he said, and looked back at her expectantly. When he hadn't said anything for a few minutes, Cecilia recalled how literally he took things and said, "When you were serving the family, Dobby, what was your life like?" "Oh, Lady, it was dreadful," he exclaimed, in a low voice. "Really dreadful. But Dobby was born at their home, Dobby was, and Dobby's mother was their house elf. So Dobby was their house elf, until Harry Potter freed Dobby," he exclaimed, and his face brightened again as he mentioned his number one hero. "Dobby had to do some dreadful things," he continued, as Cecilia looked at him sympathetically. "The family were ... were." He glanced from side to side again with fear. "They did things for you know who ... horrible, dreadful things ... they made Dobby do them ... they made Dobby ... hurt moles." He glanced sideways at Cecilia, and put the dark mark in the sky. He shuddered, and Cecilia felt quite sorry for him. Then the words dark mark triggered off some memories in her mind. "What is the dark mark?" she asked. "It is the mark of him ... you know who ... when he has done something dreadful." He looked back down. They were on his side ... and once a wizard has the dark mark, they is on the side of you know who forever. His voice trailed off, and he looked down. Cecilia decided not to press him any more, and glanced back at the bench of equipment and ingredients. "Do you know where Professor Snape is, Dobby?" she asked, feeling a little disheartened that he hadn't so much as left her a note or told her when he'd be available again. "The wizard of whom you speak," said Dobby nervously. "He is asking Dobby to tell Lady, he will be seeing Lady at the usual time tonight." "Why didn't you say so before?" "Well, Lady didn't ask." Cecilia sighed, feeling somewhat tired now. She surveyed the ingredients again and knew she had to take it easy, else she wouldn't last the day. But if she went back to her room again, she probably wouldn't sleep, and she'd probably end up dwelling on things ... on people ... on a certain someone. "Dobby, would you like you help me test some of these today?" she asked, smiling at him again. "Of course, Lady, if that's what Lady wants." He looked at her uncertainly. "But what about what Lady said before?" He looked earnestly at her again, and Cecilia thought hard about what she might have said to Dobby about her equipment. "What did I say before?" she asked, at a loss. "That Lady would break Dobby's fingers if Dobby touched anything on the bench again," he said. An image of when Cecilia had indeed said that formed in her mind, and she thought about the 3 days' work on the algae cultures Dobby had destroyed by helping cleaning up. "On this occasion, Dobby," she said, relieving her aching muscles by sitting down heavily on a stool, "I'd definitely like your help." 88,888,888. 3 hours later, and lethargy was beginning to overcome Cecilia. Dobby had worked splendidly on the potion's ingredients, following her instructions carefully, sometimes too carefully on some occasions, making sure he did everything that she'd said accurately. Aside from Dobby's confusion when she'd asked for him to allow the flask to stand, and his determination to explain that he couldn't do this because it hadn't got any legs or feet, they'd actually got through quite a lot, and Cecilia had covered several dozen pages in notes. They hadn't finished all she had intended, however, but Cecilia had twice nearly dozed off where she sat, so she left it at that and returned to her room, thankful that Dobby had returned to the kitchens. Regardless of her fondness for him, Cecilia doubted whether she could have endured the How Harry Potter Freed Dobby story again. She climbed the stairs in front of the Great Hall and, turning towards the teacher's corridor, was surprised to see someone she recognized. Madame Pomfrey. "Mrs. Frobisher, thank goodness," declared Madame Pomfrey. "Where have you been? I told Professor Snape that you needed bed rest for at least a day. And there you are, strolling round the castle as if you were as fit as a fiddle." "I do feel tired," conceded Cecilia. "I was just going back to bed actually. I haven't seen Professor Snape all day, so I went down and did some work in the potions dungeon." "Well, what a blessing I found you," admonished Madame Pomfrey. "If you had collapsed again, I just don't know what I would have said to Professor Dumbledore, I really don't." She ushered Cecilia along the first-floor corridor and into the hospital wing before Cecilia had time to protest. "There, up there. Sit," said Madame Pomfrey, pointing towards a bed as she bustled around the room, opening cupboards and pulling things out. "There's really no need, I feel fine ... but tired," said Cecilia, yawning. "Besides, Madame Pomfrey, I thought no one knew the effects of this on muggles?" "They don't," she replied, pulling out a bottle with a peeling label and pouring its meager contents into a glass. Drat, nowhere near enough. I'll have to ask Professor Snape for some more gentian root. No, you're quite right. She walked back towards Cecilia, scrutinizing the contents of another bottle through its neck. The effects of Veritaserum has never been seen on a mole, because no mole has ever survived, to my knowledge. Madame Pomfrey handed the glass of pale green liquid to Cecilia. She looked down at it, uncertainly. However, I have seen the effects of other potions on moles, ones with fewer injuries than you. She looked over at Cecilia, pointedly, and gestured her to drink what she had given her. Cecilia looked back and eyes on Madame Pomfrey, she reluctantly took a sip. It tasted awful. And haven't done yourself much good, leaving where you were to come back here, you know, she continued, scoldingly. I would advise not eating anything until at least tomorrow, just to be on the safe side. What is it? Asked Cecilia, taking her second sip. It was worse than the first, and though she'd never tasted cod liver oil, she had a sneaking suspicion the taste would not be dissimilar to this. It hasn't got a name, at least, one I could bring myself to tell you, laughed Madame Pomfrey. It's a restorative, explained Madame Pomfrey, as she began to bustle around again. If there is any Veritaserum left in your system still, that will stop your body absorbing any more. You were so lucky, Mrs. Frobisher, that you hadn't eaten much last Saturday, or you would not be sitting there turning your nose up at my grandfather's potion. She sat down on the bed next to Cecilia. I'm sorry. Cecilia looked apologetically at her. It's just ... the last time I drank anything magical, well. Madame Pomfrey nodded. It was the same for Pom-Pops, said Madame Pomfrey, smiling. My grandfather. He was the healer at Hogwarts, many years ago. The trouble he had to give potions to mole-born wizards, well. But, what you have there is his own recipe for moles. He was a doctor too? Asked Cecilia, astonished. No, not formally, at least. Pom-Pops always had an interest in moles. An unhealthy one, my grandmother said. In his own small way though, I like to think of him as a pioneer. I used to go with him to mole hospitals when I was very small, when he was treating them for magic-related injuries. That was until my mother decided it was unsuitable. If there's been anyone like him since, I've never heard of him. She glanced over at Cecilia as she yawned again. Lie back and rest here, Mrs. Frobisher. The potion will probably make you sleep. But you'll feel better. What sort of things did he do? Cecilia asked, kicking off her shoes and leaning back against the large cushions. And how is that different to how wizards do it? We cure colds, infections, viruses and the like with a potion, and that is that. Wizards are better cured, can go about their day-to-day affairs. When moles go through illnesses, it depends on the mole themselves. They can sometimes die, for no apparent reason, and from mole illnesses. Wizards are stronger. Constitutionally. She looked at Cecilia, patting her hand. My Pom-Pops, he was a half-blood wizard but went to mole school until he was 10. He was devastated when his best friend died of polio? A mole illness of which I am sure you're aware. When he came to Hogwarts, he was already particularly gifted at potions and herbology, thanks to my great-grandmother. When moles began to become ill and die mysteriously, just as you know whose reign of terror began, Pom-Pops used to go out to mole hospitals to treat them. He was considered quite an eccentric. What sort of things did he do? Asked Cecilia. How did he know what to treat them for? Madame Pomfrey frowned slightly, then realization dawned. Why yes, of course. I wondered why you'd be interested, but yes, your work with Professor Snape. She smiled at Cecilia. I couldn't honestly tell you, but he did keep his notes which I still have, somewhere. But now, she added, the tone of authority returning to her softened voice, take the time to rest. 88,888,888. When she awoke a few hours later, she realized she was alone in the hospital wing. Thankful that Madame Pomfrey wasn't there to order her back into bed, she slipped back on her shoes and made her way back to her room just as the school clock gave 5 sonorations. Severus will soon be here, she thought as she walked through high-ceilinged corridor towards the teachers' quarters. I'm so glad I didn't oversleep. I really would have been gutted if I missed out on work after all this. As she turned the corner to the small corridor towards the bedrooms, she realized that despite her reluctance in drinking Pomfrey's potion, the dull but persistent ache actually wasn't troubling her. Perhaps I'll speak to Madame Pomfrey again tomorrow. Those notes she was talking about, she thought, turning the old-fashioned ringed handle on the thick oak door. Looking round the room that she'd left this morning, she decided to tidy the mess she had created whilst sorting out her books and equipment. I suppose the upside of magic is that Mary Poppins' moment of tidying, she thought, making the bed properly and throwing her dirty clothes from that morning into a pile. As Cecilia threw her jeans across, something fell out of the pocket. The letter from Libby. As the realization grew, she stopped what she was doing and sat down on the chair before the desk, and pulled it open hurriedly, scanning the neat, handwritten lines. And Freya won a school prize for being able to recite her times tables the fastest. Mrs. Louis said that even she didn't know up to her 20 times table. How like Freya and her competitive streak, thought Cecilia, smiling at the thought of her goddaughter standing up, bold as brass, in front of the rest of the school. She looked up from the letter, taking in the coloring of what appeared to be a big purple stripy crocky-ducky fish. She knew Libby wouldn't have been able to stop Freya drawing on the back of it, and glanced further down to the last third of the letter, where she knew Libby would have put the thing that she considered most important. Her chest tightened as she read, "We are all missing you, Sec. Please call or write as soon as you can to let us know you are safe and well." Safe and well. She stood up and began to pace, contemplating the events that had almost caused her not to be safe and well aloud. Once she had shared them openly with the 4 walls of her room, she wrapped them up neatly and placed them in a box at the back of her consciousness, deliberately adding a large metaphorical padlock to it to prevent her coming across them by accident. Then she grabbed a piece of paper and began to write. Libby. Thank you for your letter, which was beautifully decorated by whom I trust is the next up-and-coming Turner Prize winner. The post here is quick, but my scattiness and usual single-mindedness towards work prevented me from actually finding your letter until this morning. It is proceeding well. She paused. Was that entirely true, she thought. Considering the context she was working in, she decided, it was. Although my research colleague is nothing like Nick. How is he, by the way? Have you seen him? How are Mum and Amy? You ask about my returning for my birthday. I'll have to let you know. But hopefully. I apologize for not having called. The place is not connected, which is why I'm writing. Please excuse the legibility. As to my safeness and wellness, Libby knows me too well to be fooled by what I write, thought Cecilia. Do I feel safe? At this particular moment in time, sitting here, writing this. Yes. I feel perfectly safe. Am I well? I feel much better than I did this morning. But still tired, and not quite yourself, another part of her mind chipped in. All right then. I'm both safe and well, but tired. However, Mrs. Elizabeth Louisa Mitchell, you'll be pleased to know that you were indeed right. I'd much rather be doing this than sitting at home feeling sorry for myself. There. She hated lying, or being economical with the truth to her best friend, but she knew what Libby would be like if she didn't hear from her, or worse, if she did and it was vague. And there might be more than a bit of trouble if Libby actually decided to visit the patent office looking for her. Satisfied. Cecilia folded up the letter, wondering where she would find an envelope amongst all her things, and, as she turned, she noticed an intense green glow in the fireplace. "Hello," she said, abandoning the letter on the table and getting up. As she did so, the glow imploded in on itself silently, leaving behind a void. "Hello," she shouted into the space where it had been. Just then, the door opened in response to her exclamation, and she looked up from her half-kneeling position before the fireplace. "Remarkable," said Snape, as he eyed her critically. "I didn't even need to knock." He walked towards her, and proffered a hand to help her up. "And such a ladylike position," he added, as she accepted his hand gratefully. "Would it be inappropriate to ask why you are down there, Mrs. Frobisher, or is it a mole ritual to which I am otherwise ignorant?" Cecilia smiled, brushing herself off as she got to her feet. "Actually, I think it's one of your rituals. A wizard ritual, I mean. I thought I saw." She paused, wondering what she had seen, and her voice trailed off, not entirely sure what she had seen. "I'm glad to see you are feeling better, at any rate. However, Madame Pomfrey is most annoyed that you are not still in the hospital wing." He sat down on the bed, eyeing the half-tidied room critically. "Scourgify," he said, pulling out his wand and flicking it in the direction of her books and glassware. "Really," he said, admonishingly. "However, I did see the state in which you left the potions dungeon, so I'm not entirely surprised." Cecilia sat down on the bed, much happier, if that was the appropriate word to describe her feeling, that Snape had actually turned up so they could do their work. Back to his usual sardonic self. Things were getting back to normal, then. "Thanks for that," said Cecilia, smiling. "And thanks for looking at the key to reaction downstairs." Snape looked over at her, one eyebrow raised. "Well, if my colleague decides that wizard shopping in Diagon, then excusing herself on sick leave for a week is acceptable." He looked at her, and Cecilia was almost sure he was attempting to express sarcasm. Someone has to take the responsibility. 88,888,888. Half an hour later and they were back to where they were from their conversation yesterday at Grimmauld Place. Cecilia was amazed that he had remembered so much, and had been astonished when he's leafed through her books and papers, and began working on some questions she had copied out from a school textbook. She looked across at him reading through them, and frowning slightly when he was unsure of something and hadn't the heart to tell him they were from a SAT's paper for 14-year-olds. "It makes sense," he said eventually, handing it back to her once he had finished. "The cells reproduce by copying themselves." "It must happen in wizards, too," said Cecilia, looking through the answers. "There has to be enough identical DNA between wizards and moles to allow reproduction to take place between us." Snape looked up briefly. "You know what I mean," she added, and continued. "Which means there can only be one chromosome different. It has to be in the gametes, otherwise we'd be completely different species." "Chromosomes?" asked Snape, curiously. Cecilia leaned over and looked at the paper answers he had his quill right next to his questions. She pointed to question 8. "Here," she said. "You answered this right. So you know they make up part of the cell." She scanned down to question 11, which he'd left blank. "Chromosomes," she said patiently, "are what you said. They replicate themselves so the cells can reproduce. But the question here," she pointed to 11, "refers to DNA. That is the chemical strand that makes up the chromosomes. In every person, it is different. Which is why everyone is different to look at." "Twins," said Snape, looking coldly between Cecilia and her finger, still pointing at the unfinished question 11 answer. "Twins?" said Cecilia, shuffling round on the bed to get more conformable. "Yes, identical twins are the exception. They are identical to one another because their chromosomes have the same sequence of chemicals, so it means their appearance is the same. This happens in the game TS, so this is why I say the fact you are a wizard or not, in biological terms, is owed to the chromosomes from whether your mother or your father. She sighed, and looked back at Snape, hoping that he would betray at least a flicker of understanding. So what you're saying is that inside each cell these chemical strands give us the features and characteristics we have. Cecilia nodded. At last. So how then do you explain how some wizards can change their appearance, if their cells all reproduce the same and they give the same features each time? He stood up, triumphant, and stood, arms folded near the end of the bed. Cecilia sighed again. Well, that's the whole point, isn't it, Severus? I don't know why. She stood up quickly and regretted it. Madame Pomfrey's potion appeared to be wearing off. No one has ever thought about it before. Well, anyway. She walked over to him. Look, are there any records of work being done into this for wizards? Anything at all? She looked pleadingly at him. Snape shook his head. Well, she said, walking back towards the desk. If I had to hazard a guess, I would say that for you to be able to do this magic ... transfiguration ... the DNA is the part that is altered. The sequence must be changed to something else for he features to be something else. And for muggles and wizards to be able to reproduce ... and for muggle-born wizards and squibs to exist ... the chromosome must be Gametian. She tuned back to look at him. From the hypothesis I am working on, at any rate, she conceded. A nice age passed. Then Snape inclined his head slightly. Cecilia looked back at him, coming to terms with her own astonishment that she had actually come out with something as profound as that. It made sense, she knew it did, but it was the first time she had ever drawn it all together. She surveyed the room for some paper to write this down. That actually does make sense, from your hypothesis, said Snape, watching her search round the room. What are you looking for? Paper. I need to get this down. I think it's important. She sat on the bed, and reached underneath for where she kept her notebook, then screamed as Snape pointed his wand at her, scrabbling to move out of the way. What? Exclaimed Snape, looking between Cecilia's horrified face from where she stood by the bathroom door and the new red-covered notebook on the bed where she had just been sitting. Cecilia sighed, and looked down. Sorry, she said quietly. It was just ... you pointed your wand at me ... and ... last week. She looked back at Snape and returned to the bed, picking up the notebook. Without meaning to, she began to cry. Snape sat back down on the chair by her desk and said nothing, waiting for her to finish. Thank you, said Cecilia quietly when she'd got it out of her system, wiping her face with the sleeve of her jumper. Right, she said, swallowing. Where were we? You were discussing, Mrs. Frobisher, about the hypothesis you were formulating about cellular reproduction in wizards. I do not believe any research has been done in this area. Therefore your hypothesis may very well be correct. He looked back at Cecilia, who had begun to write. I think the only way we can be sure if this is correct, is to check it. Are you free tomorrow evening, Severus? I'm going to need a volunteer. Snape got up. Yes, that will be fine. I'll meet you down at the potions dungeon at 6. I think our work has begun to take us in the right direction. Cecilia nodded in agreement. Thank you again, she said, smiling wanly. For what? For giving a silly mull a second chance? Well, silly mull, said Snape, handing her a transparent potion bottle containing more of the green liquid Madame Pomfrey had made her drink earlier that day. Your penance. Good night. And with that, he left, leaving Cecilia alone to pull together all that they had discussed. 88,888,888. The next day passed quickly as Cecilia prepared for an experiment. She had assembled just about every piece of glassware, tubing, instrumentation and books in the potions dungeon. Usually this would only have taken her about an hour, but Dobby was keen to assist as ever, and because her mind was focused on the setup, when she looked up to check something or make sure a base had reacted, she found she had to undo Dobby's efforts and put them together correctly. Unlike many researchers, who allowed text to set up for them, Cecilia was unusual even in the mole world because although it took her time, she found she could think clearer about the work at hand if she had a routine task to perform. At 3 p.m. she was finished, which was enough time to eat the sandwich Dobby had made for her, and she spent a considerable amount of time enjoying the cheese and Branston pickle sandwich, her first real food in over a week. "Thank you," she said to Dobby when she finished. "I really enjoyed that." "Thank you, lady," replied Dobby, magicking away her plate as she surveyed the experimental setup for the 9th time. Dobby feels proud to help Lady, because Dobby knows she fights dark wizards. But Dobby must leave now. Dobby has to help Winky and Bingo in the kitchen. We have a lot to prepare for next week. With that, he left, and Cecilia looked around again, pondered the premise again for which she had spent the whole day preparing. It went like this. If she was right, and wizard cells performed mitosis in the same way as mole cells, this would mean that the way in which moles and wizards differed was not genetically. In fact, this would not only mean they were genetically similar, hence the ability for mole-born wizards and squibs to be born, it would also mean that the difference between them was something other than inheritance. If, however, mitosis did not take place, then they'd have to come up with another hypothesis as to how mole-born wizards actually did come about. Looking around for a final time, she yawned again and decided to take a walk outside before Snape arrived. The late afternoon sun felt warm and soothing on Cecilia's face. Normally, she hated the sun, especially in the early summer months, where she'd burn mercilessly. The grounds were as lovely as she had remembered them when she'd sat out reading mysterious mythology, and she followed the path by the side of the school and down towards the lake. "I've still got a couple of hours before he arrives," she thought as she walked over the roofed bridge between the main castle and the owlery, and it occurred to her that she'd been so busy she'd forgotten to send her reply back to Libby. Ascending the wide stone steps, Cecilia considered the events of the previous evening. How embarrassing that she should get so upset, she thought. But he didn't get annoyed or frustrated. We continued to discuss about work, and he didn't slate me as being a weak mole, even when I was clearly acting like one. As she got to the top, she selected a brown school owl, and carefully tied the letter to Libby round its leg, trying to avoid the pecks of which she was the target for disturbing it from its otherwise restful afternoon. Heaven knows what he's going to say when I have to ask him for a blood sample though, thought Cecilia, as she climbed back down the stairs. It's all right to say that we agreed in principle yesterday, but another matter entirely if he refuses to believe the evidence before him. Well, if he refuses a sample, at least I can show him my own. But that won't validate the hypothesis though, she thought as she headed towards cool shade of the forest. I think once he sees what I'm trying to prove, I'm sure he'll understand the importance of it all, she thought. And then that's all I can do. Putting it aside her imperfect plans, Cecilia turned her attention to the beautiful environment around her. She felt much better even than yesterday, which can only be a good thing, especially considering the fact that she relegated Madame Pomfrey's potion to the bottom drawer of her desk untouched. She descended the hill towards the lake, the beguiling color of the flowers and plants festooning the ground layer and birds circled high overhead. What a lovely way to spend a few hours, she thought absently, and headed towards the forest edge. So caught up in her own thoughts, Cecilia had not heard the footsteps approaching from behind, and when two very large hands picked her up from the very ground she was standing on and hoisted her over a shoulder, the shocked scream she had intended to convey fell flat. "Hold on, young hoyden, you," boomed the voice belonging to the hands and shoulder. Stop struggling. You ain't half giving me a nuisance, strolling off into the forbidden forest." Recovering herself, but unable to move from the position in which this giant of a man was holding her, Cecilia screamed again. What on earth was this? And what was he going to do with her? Quieten down, lass. There's no need for that. Look, I just saved you from a fate worse than death. Still holding her, he strolled back up the hill as Cecilia struggled, stopping when he reached the hut she had noticed when she had walked past earlier, and unshouldered her. Now then, he said, putting her down in front of him. Perhaps you'd like to tell me just exactly what you're doing strolling round the grounds of Hogwarts. Shaking, and with all the bravery she could muster, Cecilia looked firmly at the man, a good 4 foot taller than her and a good 50 stone heavier. And perhaps you could tell me just exactly what you're doing picking up people and carrying them off. She coughed, trying to remain resolute, but the jelly-like feeling she had under the surface was preparing to ooze between the hairline cracks of her outer courage. It's my business to know, said the huge man before her. I am keeper of the grounds at Hogwarts, and a teacher. He leaned forward and towered over Cecilia, blocking out the southwest afternoon sun. So, young lady, who is you and why was you going into the forest? Here we go, she thought, then remembered what Dumbledore had said almost a month ago when she'd arrived, that the gamekeeper and the caretaker knew she was here. I'm sure Professor Dumbledore must have mentioned me, she began, but it would have been some time ago. I'm Cecilia Frobisher, and I'm working with Professor Snape. That's it, she thought, that's everything I have. If this giant's going to grind my bones to make his bread, he'd better get on with it soon. He folded his arms resolutely and Cecilia was unnerved to find that his manner actually conveyed every sense of honesty and steadfastness, rather than terror. This last point was heavily underlined when, as he scratched his head thoughtfully, she noticed his massive bushy beard had tiny flowers in it. After a few minutes, he smiled. Mrs. Frobisher? Asked the giant man at last. The mole? He smiled with more confidence as Cecilia nodded. Yes. Yes. That's right, Professor Dumbledore said you was comin'. He bent down to Cecilia's height. Look, I'm sorry to frighten you, it's just since the championship a few months ago, I've had to be extra careful with people I see around the grounds. When Cecilia said nothing and looked down, he added. I didn't hurt you, did I? Look, he said, gesturing towards the hut. I've got a pot of tea on. Would you like some? Cecilia nodded, trying not to let out the emotion pent up inside her, which started to ebb as she followed the man inside. Rubeus Hagrid, said the man, bowing as she entered. This is my home. Cecilia looked round at the place, as if the furniture and the belongings inside had not so much been placed there, but had grown and evolved around their owner. You're a teacher here, Mr. Hagrid? Asked Cecilia, sitting down where he was indicating, moving a pile of what appeared to be filthy pieces of cloth from a farmhouse chair. What is it that you teach? Care of magical creatures, said Hagrid, pouring the water from the boiled kettle he had taken from the grate into a large teapot and swirling around the jorum. This will be my 3rd year, as a teacher that is. I've been gamekeeper for 30 years. Milk. Cecilia shook her head. That's good, 'cause I ain't got none anyway, he added, pouring the dark tea into 2 cracked mugs. The grounds is nice, Mrs. Frobisher, but you must never go wandin' into the forest. Ain't safe for wizards leastways, and for a little mole like you, well, you wouldn't stand a chance against the werewolves and such like. Cecilia sipped at her tea. At least it had been made properly, though she was a bit disconcerted by the slightly bitter taste. What sort of creatures do you teach the care of, sir? She asked, ignoring the little mole comment. All sorts, he replied, setting down his mug. Mostly the less dangerous ones now, snarks, goshivers. But the hippogriff I had 2 years ago, he was a mighty fine fellow, mighty fine. Sentenced to death though, he were. If it hadn't been fairy. "A hippogriff?" asked Cecilia, and an image of half a hippopotamus and half a griffin materialized in her mind. Hagrid fished around in his pocket and, pulling out a picture, passed it to Cecilia. She looked at intently as the creature swooped past the image longitudinally and, as her eyes connected with those of the rider, the feelings she had done her best to put aside came marching unbidden out of their padlocked box, like a row of toy soldiers, flashing the week's memories before her. Just as he left, with young Sirius Black, that were 2 innocent lives saved that night. His voice trailed off as he saw tears silently slipping down her cheeks. "Oh my dear, whatever is the matter?" Hagrid looked at Cecilia in concern, and she handed the picture back to him. "Come on, you can tell old Hagrid," he prompted, taking her mug off her. 10 minutes later, and she had told him the whole sorry tale, relieved to finally get it off her chest, Hagrid sitting in stunned silence. "Mrs. Frobisher, I am appalled," said Hagrid, when she'd finished. "That a wizard I know so well, and have so much faith in, would do something like that to a mole, and such a little one as yourself. I am utterly flabbergasted." He smiled at Cecilia. "Thank you," said Cecilia. "I'm just glad to be able to talk to someone about it. Who doesn't have a vested interest in it all?" she added, to herself. "Do you know Harry?" she added, remembering Hagrid's eyebrows raising in interest when she mentioned him. "Do I know Harry? Well, of course I do. I was the one who took him to his aunt and uncle's house for Dumbledore. I was the one who went and found him to give him his letter, tell him he were a wizard." Cecilia smiled at the down-to-earth affection he expressed. "It's hard for him, with what he has had to go through. If it hadn't been for Ron and Hermione, I don't know how he would have got through the last 4 years here. Especially the last year." "Why?" asked Cecilia. "What happened last year?" "The Triwizard Championship, of course." He looked across at Cecilia's bemused expression. "How much has Professor Snape told you about the recent history of Hogwarts?" "Not much," conceded Cecilia. "But I do know that the head dark wizard Voldemort was back." She put her hand over her mouth as Hagrid shushed her. "Well, to cut a long story short, he you know who managed to get hold of Harry, and use his blood to get reborn. It was through sheer luck that Harry managed to get away from him, put up one hell of a fight though, did Harry." Cecilia turned this sentence over in her mind. "This you know who Voldemort, this evil wizard he was able to come back from the brink of death using Harry's blood." Half an hour later and Cecilia is privileged to hear the unexpurgated story of the events surrounding the Triwizard Championship, and it was only when she heard the school clock faintly toll 6 that she excused herself from Hagrid's company.